So, Wendy, I wanted to talk to you today because you are involved in this very interesting women's rights case. It involves registering for the military draft. Tell us about what the case is about and why is this important? There hasn't been an actual draft in operation since 1973.
Yeah, so that might make it seem irrelevant, but I'll explain to you why it's highly relevant and, in my view, probably the most important women's rights case in the last 50 years, maybe longer. I filed a federal lawsuit in Massachusetts federal court recently to challenge a federal law that mandates men register for the draft. It's called Selective Service. Even though we don't have one, it doesn't matter. You still have to register. And that law has been in place since the early 1900s. But it forbids women to register. And you might wonder why a women's rights lawyer would want women to register, because aren't women generally opposed to the military, opposed to war, opposed to the draft? The answer is it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how you feel about war or the military. What matters is, as a woman, you should be treated equally under all laws. And this happens to be a very blatant example of how discriminatory the law can be. Not all laws are as obvious as this one, but this one literally says men must, women can't.
Yeah.
If you are a woman and you tried to register, then you'd go to the button where it asks you what your sex is. And when you click on female, you get an error message. So it's an important case in the sense that it's the most vivid example of the kind of discrimination women are still subject to. And as we talked about last time I was on this show, women in America have never had basic legal equality. We still don't. Under the Constitution, women are subject to unequal treatment by all branches of the government, all laws, all government official treatment. I mean, everything you could think of, women are subject to unequal treatment. That doesn't mean they're always treated unequally. The point is that they can be. And people like me have been trying to fix that since the dawn of our country. And here's a good example of not only what the problem looks like, but a good device by which lawyers like me can go into court and say, here's another opportunity for you, judge, to close the gap, give women equality, and to do so by fixing this federal law, require women to register for the draft. Because frankly, if women want full legal equality, and we do, then we should accept that we've got to register for the draft alongside men.
And that's one of the things that I thought was so interesting about this when you told me about it, is I sort of couldn't believe it. It was like, wait a minute, you mean I knew you had to register for the draft. I knew that was still required. I didn't realize that it was only men, and also that if a woman goes and tries to fill out the form online, it rejects her. It seems to me that I guess my question is, what is the argument against having women register for Selective Service? Because, as you point out, I mean, they're serving in the combat roles now. They're throughout the military. We have a recruitment problem as it is. We know that. And if something really happened and we needed to draft people, it would seem to me you'd want to be able to draft women, men, all able-bodied Americans.
That's right.
You'd want access to them.
Able-bodied and capable ought to trump sex.
Yeah, right.
So I think we all can agree that's logical. And several countries around the world do equally enlist and draft and conscript men and women, including Norway, Sweden, Israel. I mean, these are not crazy countries that are all, men's rights. It's really the basic human right to serve your country, that women have that feeling that they are equally worthy, that's reflected in this discriminatory law. Women want to feel equally valuable. Well, the most important aspect of this case really is that when the Supreme Court ruled on whether this law is constitutional, which was back in the early 80s, it said it's okay to exclude women from the draft because they are not allowed to fight in combat on the front lines. And that was true at that time. Well, about 10 years ago, that the last vestige of that policy and or legal requirement was erased. Women can now serve in combat in all the ways you can imagine what that means: dying in combat, fighting on the front lines, flying planes and steering the big ships. They can do everything. And because that changed 10 years ago, there has been an argument ever since, well, now that women are on the front lines, what do we think about this law that forbids them to register for the draft? Isn't the Supreme Court decision now null and void? Because the only basis for that ruling, it's called Roscoe versus Georgia, the only basis for the Supreme Court's justification in Roscoe that said it's okay constitutionally to reject women was that they were not combat ready because they couldn't fight on the front lines, according to federal law and policy. That's gone now. So there have been several lawsuits filed over the past 10 years to try to get the Supreme Court to overturn Roscoe.
I wanted to ask you about that because one of those cases, at least, was a man. Right?
All of them have been men.
All have been men. Okay, fair enough. But you do have someone, Jacqueline Fenora. I don't know if I'm saying her name correct, but you have a woman who, like you say, who tried to register, and she's the complainant in this case. But what happened with those other cases where it was a man who was, I guess, complaining that why should he have to register for the draft if women didn't have to? Which is actually a legitimate question, I guess.
It is a legitimate question. It's just a little whiny because is a man really suffering by a law that requires him to register just because a woman can't? It's kind of childish, I think. But
Right.
Having said that, the law does allow men to mount challenges, and that is partly why several of the recent lawsuits have been men and men's rights groups going into court and saying, I'm not registering unless you make women register. And they're making this one of the same arguments I'm making, which is that the basis for the Roscoe ruling is gone now. Women are on the front lines. But the real reason I filed this case at this moment in time, because again, as you said, there's no draft. We don't apparently have a war. There's no real reason to make this a hot issue. But there is a case pending in the California federal court system called Valame. It was filed as Valame versus Biden. A man named Valame sued the federal government under this law for the same reason we just discussed. He thinks it's discriminatory against him, a man, that he, when he turned 18, should register, but women don't have to. And his case, according to all of my sources at very high levels, is headed to the United States Supreme Court. So why is this important to women? Because number one, I'll be damned if a man is going to be the voice for women on such an important constitutional question. It ought to be women who speak for women when the country's highest court makes such an important decision. But also, this guy, Valame, made several kinds of claims. He filed a claim under the Equal Rights Amendment, for example. Well, that's good because he's arguing that the Equal Rights Amendment is valid, which I agree with, but he did not make good arguments. I want to make the best arguments for women. He's a man making weak arguments for men under the Equal Rights Amendment. And then the worst thing that he did, Andrew, and this is also true in all of the men's rights cases that have been filed, they're saying make women register for the draft, but don't give them full equality.
Right.
Now, think about that. The whole reason women have been justifiably subjugated in this country for centuries has been tied to this idea that they're not worthy because they don't die for their country the way men do. They don't serve their country the way men do. They're not the same value as men. Well, now we know women are bleeding to death alongside men on the front lines, and we, especially my case, are making the argument that if you now want us to register for the draft, you now expect us to die on the front line of battle, you damn well better give us full equality, period. As a quid pro quo, you do not ask someone to die and bleed to death for their country and make them bleed to death as a second-class citizen. That is insanity, that is unconscionable, that is irrational, and we want to make that argument. And I filed my lawsuit because none of the men's rights cases made that argument. They said, make women register for the draft and keep them subjugated as second-class citizens. No.
Okay, so you're listening to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Andrew Walworth. I'm here with Wendy Murphy. She's a lawyer. She is a law professor at New England Law Boston, and she's a columnist at the Boston Herald. So, Wendy, you mentioned the ERA. How does this relate to that? And also, how does it relate, or does it relate to the Scrimeti case, which we talked about before, which I noticed in your brief, you make reference to it. So tie those together for me. What Skrmetti, ERA, and this latest effort?
Yeah, and hopefully I can make it simple because it's a little complicated.
Yeah, I'm sorry, but we only have like a minute left for this, but it's fascinating stuff.
Well, the Skrmetti case is a Supreme Court decision that's coming down in June. We're expecting it in June. And it is going to make the decision, not about the ERA per se, but about whether sex is mutable or immutable. Why does that matter? Because if the court says that sex is mutable, which would be a reversal from what it said 30 years ago, that of course sex is determined at birth, immutable, you cannot change it. And because it's immutable, categories with immutability deserve the highest levels of legal equality. Right.
So we talked about this before, but this is basically this is an argument made by that transgender should be treated as women under the law. And the problem with that, from your point of view, is that means that sex can change or is mutable, as you say, and that undercuts the whole notion of women being treated as a special, not a special class, but as that sort of highest class of when you look at the discrimination, right?
If your characteristic is immutable, you're entitled to the highest degree of legal equality. If you're mutable, you're not. Right. The trans people that filed the Skrmetti lawsuit said to the Supreme Court, we fall under the word sex, which has always applied to women. And because we're under the word sex and we are mutable,
right,
we are asking for second-class protections under the Constitution. Women were screaming at the time, how dare you, trans people, use the word sex and ask for second-class treatment of women under the word? No. So my case that I just filed, although you would think that the military draft isn't necessarily related to transgender issues, it absolutely is. The Skrmetti case, in combination with the Valame case, are going to give the Supreme Court of the United States an opportunity to rule on three critical questions for women. Is the ERA valid? Regardless of whether the ERA is valid, are women now required to register for the draft? And whether or not they are women finally, because they're dying on the front lines of battle for their country, are they finally entitled to constitutional equality under the 14th and 5th Amendments, even if the ERA is not valid? Those are the most important women's rights issues to be decided by the United States Supreme Court in many, many, many decades in this country. And until I filed my case, the only people that were going to the Supreme Court making these arguments were trans people and men. My case is going to put a stop to that and insist that women get a front seat and primary voice on these vital issues.
Wow. Fascinating stuff. Wendy, it's always good to have you on the show. Enjoy our conversation so much. You're listening to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I've been talking to Wendy Murphy. That's our program for today. Thanks for listening. We'll see you back here tomorrow.